Hey everybody, I am back today with a follow-up from yesterday's topic, which was about reprogramming your attachment style. And so today I'm going to be talking about what do you do in the moment in terms of neural retraining when you are triggered by something going on in a relationship. It could be a disagreement or a fight, or it could be something else, right? Some of us are more triggered by, when we feel like our partner is neglecting us. Some of us are more triggered when we feel criticized by our boss. So this applies to all those kinds of situations in relationships where you're triggered by an interaction directly with another human being. So I hope that this helps you. I decided to talk about this topic because I have a client that was really, really wanting to figure this out for herself. She was really struggling with, how she would react when she would be in an argument with her partner. And she noticed that she tends to get extremely dysregulated when she and her partner fight, and it can last for days or even longer. So for her, this was a really, really big deal in terms of her own mental, emotional, and physical well being. She also noticed that, she had this tendency of just, getting more and more and more angry, and then eventually just shutting down into a freeze response and wanting to push away. And she noticed that, her patterning was wanting her partner to, quote, fix her feelings, basically like make it all better for her, or pull her out of it, sort of thing. But the reality is that that doesn't usually work. He can't always do that because he's either equally dysregulated or she's so high on the scale that nothing works. And I'm going to explain why that is today and why it's so important for you to regulate your own nervous system when you're struggling with an interaction and agreement. Like that is the most important thing for you to do, first and foremost, before anything else, before any other, conflict resolution can happen. And of course, when he's not able to pull her out of it, or he doesn't, this makes her even more mad, right? And of course, that doesn't really help with anything. So let's talk about what to do about that. And, the other thing for her was that all of this intensity that comes up for her in fight also relates back to her childhood, to not feeling loved and also feeling attacked a lot by one of her parents. And so, yeah, both of those things happened a lot in her childhood, and she still had quite a bit of trauma from that time in her life. So now, of course, she has some really big survival programming that comes up in her relationships if she is not feeling verbally adored all the time, which, of course, is not realistic. It's not possible to, stay in that honeymoon phase at all times in a long term relationship. And it's also not possible to never disagree with your partner, right? So these are issues that we need to work through for better mental, emotional, and physical health. So if you didn't see my last video yet about reprogramming your attachment style, I highly recommend watching that. It's actually a super important foundation for what I'm going to talk about in this video. Actually, many of the things I talk about in that video need to ideally be rewired first before you really go into this work that you're doing in the present moment. And as I talk about in that video, the reason for that is because the roots of your survival responses in the present are memories and belief systems that came from those memories, right? And I talk about how to work on those in the prior video. Doing that first will make what I talk about doing in this video so much easier. Not doing that first will make it feel like you are battling yourself whenever you try to do what I suggest today, because you are. You would be battling against your subconscious, which is trying to keep you safe and is way more powerful than your conscious mind. So you're pretty much always going to lose that battle. So what I'm going to talk about today is what you do once you have addressed those roots of the tree, those past experiences that set up the way you respond in relationships now. But the part today is then about breaking down the huge neural habit that has formed from practice over many, many years. This I like to equate to the trunk of the tree or the branches, both really. And that is the neural network that is so strong for that survival programming in the relationship. So let's talk about it. What should you do when you find your attachment programming is triggered, i.e., you are not feeling safe or loved in a relationship for whatever reason, even if it's actually not the other person's fault, which is often the case. It's really just our old wounding coming up. But that is what I mean when I say triggered, right? It means that there's a sore spot, there's a sensitive spot, and somebody poked it, and then boom, you explode into this survival response. So what do you do when that happens? Whether it's an argument or you're receiving constructive criticism or you're feeling neglected by your partner, or maybe it's like actually a work relationship or a friendship, that's okay. This can all apply there too. So first of all, I just like to make this sort of special note or disclaimer that, you first have to decide whether what is going on in that relationship is largely just an internal trigger, that wound that somebody, accidentally poked unknowingly, and then boom, you explode into, fear, anxiety, or anger and rage, or a freeze response where you just shut down and go internal, right? So you've got to make the determination if that's what's happening or if something really unacceptable is happening in the relationship, right? If there is abuse going on or intentional neglect or something, then that probably warrants at the very least a conversation. And in cases of abuse, typically leaving the relationship is the best thing to do. But even if it is more of a conversation worthy issue, the best thing to do by far is to do what I'm going to say in this video first before you even have that conversation, because the conversation is going to go much better if you're starting from a point of a regulated, calm nervous system. That it's really, and if you've been alive long enough, you know that it doesn't really go well to have important conversations, emotional conversations, when you are enraged or when you are so afraid that you are shaking, or you are so shut down that it's hard to find the words, right? All of these survival responses really get in the way of good communication. And I'm going to talk more about that. So if none of that is going on, it's not like abusive, intentionally neglectful or something like that, and your old childhood wounding is just coming up and you're ready to reprogram the rest of it, this is what you do. In my experience, it's best to separate from your partner or the interaction with whoever it is for a bit when you're really, really triggered in the interaction with them. So why is that? Well, it's because when we're in a survival state, i.e. fight, flight, or freeze, we perceive other people's words and actions inaccurately. And what we perceive is threat. Everything's a threat because we already feel threatened. Not necessarily because what they are doing or saying is actually threatening. Has that ever happened to you? Yeah, that's happened to me a lot, where the other person was being perfectly normal, friendly, whatever, they were having good communication, whatever, but it stepped on one of my old landmines, and then boom, I feel threatened, and so everything they do then feels threatening. They could be saying the sweetest, most loving things, but if we're in a survival state, we will reject it and continue to feel threatened. That is part of that survival state, is to look for threat and to find threat when we're in that state. So what does that lead to? Well, it leads to a lot of misunderstandings. Of course, if we are misperceiving everything, then what comes out of us and back at them is not going to be appropriate to the actual situation we're in. In this state, we also cannot easily access the states of love and compassion and openness and whatever, which are needed for resolution, right? And so in this state, we can't really contribute anything very beneficial to resolution. So that's really, really, really important to know. Also, once one person gets triggered into a survival state in an interaction, that person usually ends up triggering the other person into a survival state as well. This is something our brains are designed to do. When we sense threat from another person, and it is a threat, it is a threat, I should say, if the other person is in a survival state, right? This is what the brain is not designed to do. It goes, oh, you are showing signs of being angry right now. That's not safe for me. And so, boom, your nervous system turns on that survival state too. We pick that up from other people almost instantly in their tone of voice, in their facial expressions, in their body language, their words, and other things too. This flip where the brain goes, oops, that person doesn't seem safe right now, and turns on survival in you, it's not conscious. It isn't a choice. It is happening without your conscious control. That doesn't mean that if you're aware of it, you can't shift back. You can, but most people don't have those skills, right? So just assume that if you get triggered and flipped into survival state, that it's going to do that to the other person too. And once both people are in a survival state, misunderstandings really explode. And now you're just going around and around in a trigger fest. Does that resonate with you? Have you been there? Yeah, it's not productive in the slightest. And a lot of times we unintentionally do a lot of damage to our relationships when we're in one of those states and we continue trying to interact in one of those states. So maybe it goes without saying, but since the other person in the interaction is the perceived threat, according to your brain, it is very difficult to reset your nervous system back to that calm, healing state known as safe and social while you're in that person's presence. Okay, that makes sense, right? The danger seems to still be present. So why would your brain let down its guard? Yeah. So that is why, those are many reasons why it's so important to separate yourself from the interaction to reset your nervous system. And in that context, you can actually show your brain that you are safe, that your partner or your workmate is not a tiger, just a domesticated kitten. So I will acknowledge right now that for those people with an anxious attachment style, separating during a disagreement with your partner may feel like you are going to die. And I laugh about that only because it's obviously not true. You're not going to die, but it feels like you're not going to survive unless you resolve the conflict immediately. But I also want to acknowledge that, feelings are not facts, right? And that just isn't true. So please do try what I am saying, what I'm suggesting, even if, it feels like, oh, that'd be impossible for me. I have actually done this with many people with anxious attachment styles. And when they do all the stages of things that I recommend for rewiring this patterning, they absolutely can do it and they get really, really comfortable with it over time. It just takes a little practice and a little convincing of your brain that it is safe for you to take that separation and address your own nervous system by yourself. So, how do you go about removing yourself from the interaction? Well, if it's somebody that you are close to, a family member or your partner, I recommend being real with yourself and with them and saying something along the lines of, I'm just really triggered right now. It's not really your fault, but some of my old issues are getting triggered. And I need some time to go reset my nervous system so that I can have a calm, rational, and even loving conversation with you. Yeah. And if it's an acquaintance that you don't normally talk about emotions with, just excuse yourself to go to the bathroom. They don't need any more information than that. You don't have to be vulnerable with them. You can just do what you need to do for yourself and for the interaction to then improve, right? So once you're on your own, you can use a neural retraining process. There are many different types that may work in this context to get your emotional reaction or your survival reaction down to a 0. You do not want to go back to the conversation with that person until you've gotten your number all the way to 0, ideally. And if you don't get yourself all the way down the scale to a calm state, when you go back to the interaction, you're likely to get triggered again pretty quickly. So that's my recommendation, and it comes with a lot of personal experience. Remember that this programming is coming up because some part of you from childhood is feeling unsafe in the relationship, in that particular interaction. So your primary goal with the neural retraining process that you choose is to show your brain that you really are safe. And telling your brain by talking to yourself, like saying, I'm safe, it's okay, blah, 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 that almost never cuts it by itself. So, just skip that part, or at least include it with other techniques that really, really work for you. And the reason why I'm such a big stickler about working your way down the scale is because a lot of people will do one thing, they'll talk to themselves, or maybe they'll do a little tapping or something else, and then they just want to jump right back into life, and they don't even check to see, oh, am I still kind of upset about this when I think about it? So if you do that, then obviously you haven't fully addressed the issue, right? And so what that means is that when you go back to the interaction or back to life, it's going to come back up. It's going to come right back into your face at some point, right? So you might as well deal with it in that moment and really be accountable and make sure the process that you're using is working to get yourself all the way down to 0. And if you haven't done the prep work of working on your traumas and, issues from past relationships, including with your parents, that may have set up why you're responding so intensely in a issue in your relationship now, then you may not be able to get yourself all the way to a 0 in that moment. So that's why I really recommend you do that groundwork first, ideally. But, even if you haven't gotten to it yet and you want to try this in the midst of an intense situation, that's okay. Just know that you may not get down to a 0, may not be able to. You might get down halfway and then plateau or something. And that would be expected, because if your subconscious still has all these references from the past about why you should not feel safe in this situation in the present, then it will keep you in some of a survival state. So, I know that to some of you who have not used these tools before, that may sound impossible to get your emotional reaction down all by yourself. And it's because you don't really feel safe, right? And so you think, oh, how could that possibly go away? This feels so unsafe, and it feels unnatural to feel safe right now, right? But that's just your programming. That's just your subconscious doing its thing, playing that old tape over and over again in your relationships. And maybe you feel like a victim in this scenario, and so you want the other person to apologize or even grovel and to help you let it go. But let's be real, is that really what you want? I had this type of patterning in relationship most of my life, and I learned it from my parents, who were always the victims of each other, were always fighting, and really didn't have any skills for conflict resolution or dealing with their own emotions. And so when I started rewiring this pattern in myself, I did not do the prep work. I'll just say I did not work on my memories from childhood ahead of time. But what happened is I really started watching what was going on inside myself in those moments. And I started questioning what was real and what was just my feelings, right? Not the truth, just how I feel. Those two are different a lot of the time. So I would watch my thoughts go things like, he's a jerk, and I can't believe he said that, and he clearly doesn't love me. If he did, he could never say something like that. Right? I was quite a drama queen in my head. And things like, I can't let it go unless he apologizes and proves that he loves me. Well, those thoughts were not really true, and they were setting up a really toxic pattern in my relationships. I always was expecting the other person to fix my emotions, when I would get really triggered. And that's ridiculously unfair to the other person, especially when, our own patterning is more of the problem than they are. And of course, over time, if you are always expecting the other person to, quote, solve your emotions, it breeds a lot of resentment, right? People don't want that role. Nobody wants that role. We want to ideally be responsible just for our own emotions. Some of us don't even want to do that. But we certainly don't want to be responsible for other people's emotions. That doesn't mean that we can't really screw up and hurt someone and that we shouldn't take accountability for that. We absolutely should. But it just means that, if we are triggered because of our own patterning, then we need to deal with our own emotions. It's really important. And of course, it also wasn't true that I was always a victim. I was also a contributor to those situations. I was not always being kind or compassionate or loving either, right? I hurt my partner sometimes. And I saw myself not wanting to take accountability for that by indulging how bad I felt and making it all about that. And we tend to do that as humans when we're in a survival state, right? It's like we get tunnel vision and all we can focus on is what we feel threatened by. But there is another way you can get your brain out of that loop and resolve your own survival response. When I really asked myself, what do I truly want right now? In this situation, it was this is with my partner. So, my answer might be different if it was with somebody else. But with my partner, it was always, I just want to feel loved, connected, and safe. And I want my partner to feel that too with me. Right. So then I asked myself, well, how am I contributing to that? Holding on to anger, resentment, blame, victimhood, or whatever other thing was coming out of that survival response was not contributing anything to us getting back to that better place. It was just prolonging our separation, our disagreement. So, in the name of taking accountability for creating what I want, I had to ask myself, how can I contribute positively to creating the love and connection and etc. that I want and that he wants going forward? What that led to is the realization that first and most importantly, I had to address my own emotional state and nervous system reaction in that moment. I had to do it for myself. I had to take accountability for what my emotions were doing, and soothe myself all the way back down to that calm, safe, and social state in order to be able to contribute anything loving or healing to that situation. And then I started using neural retraining tools on my own to do that. And in the beginning, especially because I was doing it unguided, it was slow, it was challenging. I had not addressed those roots of the tree yet from my past. So I could feel myself battling my subconscious desire to protect myself at all costs. And that, pattern of trying to overprotect myself in, these situations and relationships is also how I destroyed a lot of relationships previously. So I had to be really honest with myself about that. And that was a good motivation to do things differently in future relationships. But lo and behold, I was able to get myself down to a zero a number of times in situations like that where I was in a fight with my partner. And each time I did that, the next disagreement resulted in less and then less and then less of a survival response in me each time. And I started to remain calmer in disagreements and be able to see my partner's perspective more easily and not just be knocked over and knocking him over with my own overwhelming emotional response. So it was very, very freeing to our relationship and to me. This process, I like to think of as the slow breaking down of that neural habit or the trunk and branches of that toxic tree. So as I did that, I also began planting a new tree. And what I mean by that is growing a new neural network for how I want to feel in those situations going forward. For me, I wanted to feel calm. I wanted to feel loving and compassionate towards my partner's feelings. And I reinforced this in my neurology by actually accessing those feeling states while I rewired the old response. I like to call that adding new data to the old neural programming, which is literally what we're doing. So for that to happen, we have to actually feel those feelings. You know, this gets easier to access as we work our way down the emotional intensity scale, from being triggered, right? So it's pretty hard to go from really, really triggered directly over to, oh, I feel calm and relaxed. I mean, I'm sure you know that. You've experienced that. It's not that, it's pretty hard to do if you're very triggered. So, but what does work is as you come down the scale in the trigger, then it's easy to go up the scale with the good feelings. So that's what I found work. I also wanted to start to perceive, i.e., believe these situations with my partner to actually be good opportunities for our relationship, opportunities to understand each other better, to get better at conflict resolution and repairing our bond, and, potentially even bring us closer. So, how can we teach the brain that and actually feel it to be true? Well, you're not going to get there until you reduce the emotional intensity of that trigger. So that's number one. That has to happen first. However, as you do that, perceiving the situation in another way becomes much easier. As I think I've shared before, beliefs are just thoughts that are linked to a really strong emotion. So as we think these new thoughts, the things that we want to think and perceive about, having a disagreement with our partner, what we need to do then is intentionally link those to really positive feelings. And the way that we do that is by feeling those really positive feelings um, right after we think that thought. And then we think the thought again, and then we feel those feelings again. We need to actually access the feeling state, not just think about feeling that way. But if you do that in a number of times in short succession, you do little repetitions, very short ones, then you can actually create a pretty good link, actually a pretty strong link between those emotions and the thought. And then the thought really starts to feel very true because the emotions attached to it are what are making it feel true. So that is really, really good for your subconscious because it will then start to reference that perspective as your new default whenever a disagreement occurs. And that's the goal. So we teach this, and we also have guided processes for doing this in the Wired for Wellness program, and it works really well. So I would suggest getting an experience with a professional before you just play around with it. It's tricky if you've never done it before, but once you know the process, it becomes pretty simple. There is another really important thing I want to teach you about how you can improve your relationship as you heal your attachment trauma. And it was a total game changer for me and my husband. It's all about making the transition from fixing to creating. So I'm sure you may have noticed that our societies are obsessed with problem solving, and we apply that even to ourselves and to other people. So we judge ourselves and others as not good enough in some way because of XYZ. And then we think we need to be or they need to be fixed in order for us to be okay, right? So if you've ever applied this way of thinking to your romantic partner, not only does it not work, it actually is pretty damaging and not so great for relationships. So when I first got married, whenever we would get into a disagreement, we would go around and around in circles trying to hash it out, like basically go over what had happened and point out the other person's wrongs, right? Thinking that if they could just see our point of view, it would resolve the situation. Well, it didn't. It never did. Why? Well, because we were both so entrenched in our survival response, we could not see outside of our own protective perspective. Beyond that, it did not work because all we were doing was pointing out the other person's faults or inadequacies. And somehow we thought that would lead to resolution or feeling close again. I mean, it's kind of hilarious actually when I think about it now, but it is like the default way that many couples are trying to resolve things in relationships. And if you've tried, you know it doesn't work. It just that is not the approach that really gets the job done. So what's the alternative? Instead of focusing on what happened, which in many cases was just a misunderstanding or an accident where we stepped on each other's wounds without realizing it, instead, we choose to start focusing on what we want to create. You know, what happened already happened. The feelings were already triggered. So the most important question is, where do we go from here? How do we move forward, not backwards, right? And if you're rehashing it, most likely you're moving backwards. You're getting yourself triggered again. You're not actually moving forwards in terms of resolution. So the best way to direct that process is to get clear on what we each want. So in every case, when my partner and I drilled down to the root of it, we both just wanted to feel loved, close, and safe with each other. And we wanted to feel loving and help the other person feel safe too. So from that perspective, we then asked ourselves, well, what action could we each take to contribute to that? Not just in the moment of resolving the disagreement, but also in general in our relationship. And of course, the actions that thinking process led to were very different from the ones we had been taking before because we had a shared goal or vision. We also felt like we were no longer on opposite sides from each other, right? Having this battle of minds. We were on the same side because we did want the same thing. And this approach also forced us to take accountability for our part in either creating or standing in the way of that creation, of really having what we wanted to have happen in the relationship. And that was a very good thing for both of us and our relationship. So we've also been applying this creation process to other things that we both want. Every so often, we sit down together and we ask each other what we want to create for our life together. And then we think through how we can both contribute to that. So let's say my husband says he wants to go fishing once a week. You know, I might say, okay, how can I help him with that? Because I do love him and I want him to be happy. So, like, maybe we make a standing day and time that he goes fishing once a week, and maybe we get him the gear that he needs, et cetera, right? Um, and often our visions are shared. Like when we were living in Portland, we both knew we wanted to be in a sunnier location where we could spend more dry time outside. So we started asking ourselves, okay, what actions can we each take together to set ourselves up for that and make it happen? So my husband started looking at job postings, and I started looking at houses and various places we might be open to living. You know, we started looking at what those other locations had to offer in terms of outdoorsy opportunities and other things that we like to do. And we started preparing our house for sale and getting rid of stuff we didn't want to take with us, right? There were many actions that needed to occur, but getting clear on our shared vision and where we wanted to go together, that was the important first step. You know, I'm going to do a separate video on why creating from a vision of your true desire gives you much better results in your life than trying to problem solve your life. But I'll just give you this one example to illustrate. You know, let's say my partner and I had just decided we hated the Portland rain and we went about thinking about ways to, quote, fix our problem. In that case, we might have just thought, oh, well, we'll just take more vacations, or we'll just move to any sunny desert place and that'll be fine. Well, we tried the vacations. It didn't get us what we wanted. I also know I would not have been happy moving to just any old desert town. You know, my specific desire was to be able to spend time outside in nature, right? So we needed to get clear on the vision in order to take the correct action steps to get to what we actually wanted. And we did, and now we are in love with where we live, and it's fantastic. So you see, focusing on what you do not want and trying to remedy that can sometimes lead you away from what you really want, or at the very least, not resolve anything. So, if that's what you've been doing in your life, which I think is what most people are doing all day long, I highly recommend you try this process of creation and starting with a vision and then coming back to the present and going, okay, well, what would be the next step that I would need to take if that vision were going to come true, right? So, one other loose end I wanted to tie up is, for those of you out there who are wondering, well, in regards to like conflict in my relationship, like, do I ever talk about it? Do we ever, hash things out? The answer is yes, you can totally talk about what happened, but what I was trying to convey here is that the state of your nervous system when you talk about it is critical. And you want to be calmed down into that regulated state again before you have that conversation, because the conversation will go very differently. Your perspective on it will be different. If they reset their nervous system, their perspective on it will be different. And most likely, you will both be able to access a lot more understanding and compassion and things like that. The other thing I would suggest is that, when you have the conversation again, that you really focus on taking accountability for your own triggers, right? For the fact that what they did may not have been that bad, but you overreacted. This is so common as humans, and we like to put it all on the other person, but the reality is that's just not what's going on the majority of the time. So really pick and choose the kinds of things that you hash out, right? If it was just like a misunderstanding and you just didn't communicate optimally and you both recognize that, you can just go, oh, yeah, we just didn't communicate that ideally, huh? I wonder if there's a better way we could create optimal communication in that situation. Not to say that you need to be a perfectionist about it, and if they don't communicate that way in the future, that you get all upset. That's not the right approach. But, in the interest of trying to create together, you could go, oh, well, how could we have communicated that where it would have gone better, right? And you can kind of brainstorm that together on the same side, right? And so that's how I recommend doing conflict resolution is if there is anything you want to improve upon about how the interaction goes, you first get on the same side. And then you go, how could we have created this in a way that would have felt better to both of us? And that's the important part, because we tend to like to hyperfixate on our own feelings and our own desires and our own needs, and at the expense sometimes of the other person. But when you get into that creation mindset, then you're on the same side, you're doing it together, and you're finding that place in the middle that really works for both of you. So if you found this video helpful, please like, comment, and subscribe so other people can find information like this too, and hopefully get a lot of help from it. And also so that I know that you are getting something out of these videos and you want me to keep making them. So if you do want to rewire your attachment patterning, please reach out to me at www.drkarencuritan.com or sign up for the Wired for Wellness program at www.wiredforwellness.org. All right, thank you so much for listening, and I will see you in the next video.